Alright guys, today we are going to, or on this video, we are going to discuss the presidencies of Ford and Carter, their domestic policies, as well as their foreign policies. Again, just like the last two notes that we've done online in the Flip Classroom, just make sure if you have any questions about these notes to post them online so that everyone, if they have questions, they can be asked, because they might have the same questions as you do. Okay, so as we know, Gerald Ford becomes Nixon's vice president after Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigns from office. He resigned from office totally different. It was not a part of the Watergate scandal. He was in his own scandal about land. He resigns. Nixon chooses Ford, who had been the minority whip. He was in the House. He's the leader of the Republican Party in the House. So when Nixon resigns because of the Watergate scandal, Ford becomes the new president. This should say first, not fifth. One of his first actions was that he granted Nixon a full pardon so that he would not be indicted in any of the crazy stuff that was going on with Watergate. As we're watching the movie, you will see that a lot of people were indicted, and they did go to jail because of what happened in Watergate. Nixon could have been one of those people, but because President Ford pardoned him, he was not. This is going to cost him a lot of support because many Americans wanted Nixon to be indicted. Many Americans believed that politics were corrupt and that indicting Nixon and possibly having him go to jail would help with political corruption. Another thing that he faced, besides people not supporting him because of his pardon of Nixon, was inflation. Stagflation, had become a thing during Nixon's last few years in office, and it's only going to increase during Ford and Carter's stints in office. And unemployment is also going to rise in both of their stints in office. And so the 1970s and the Ford and Carter presidencies, both of their presidencies are going to be marked with a economy that's going to start going down. After years and years of our economy looking great in the 70s and the early 80s, our economy is going to actually it's going to go down with something called stagflation, which is a rising inflation and unemployment. Ford's domestic policy was called WIN. He believed that the easiest way to get rid of inflation and unemployment was this WIN program. WIN was a program in which he asked Americans, he just asked them to cut back on their oil consumption and to take other energy-saving methods, mainly driving smaller cars, using less oil. Did not work. There were no incentives. He just asked people nicely to do something, and there was no incentives for them to do it. So WIN does not work, and the economy gets worse. His foreign policy was different than WIN. In his foreign policy, he followed pretty much the same foreign policy as Nixon. If you remember from the last section, chapter, Nixon's foreign policy was known as détente. Make sure you know what the word détente means. Détente, East to Cold War tension, and realpolitik. As we discussed, both of these things kind of took back what we had been following in our containment policy. We would not just look at a country and say, oh, that country's communist. We need to fear them, or we need to make sure that their communism doesn't spread. With realpolitik and détente, we would actually look and see if that country actually had real power. Vietnam had no real power. So if we had followed détente when looking at Vietnam, we probably would not have been in the Vietnam War. China has power. the Soviet Union has power. So those are the countries that we would look at and that we could take some action on if we wanted to look at real détente in real politics. With Ford, he signed the Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki Accords were a compromise or a treaty between the United States, the Soviet Union, and 34 other nations, which said that every human being had a right to basic human rights, and that these countries should follow these human rights. He also signed SALT II. SALT II, again, following a more détente and trying to ease Cold War tensions. In SALT II, we said that we would reduce the number of nuclear weapons that we made, each country, the Soviet Union and the United States. Again, it follows with SALT I, which was signed by Nixon when in some of the first years that he had in office, that also lowered the number of nuclear warheads that we had. Even though Ford had an okay foreign policy, his domestic policy, that doesn't work and the economy gets worse and worse. And so in 1976, Americans think that they need a change, and they switch parties, and they elect Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, as president in 1976. Jimmy Carter was, and still is, a Christian fundamentalist. He is actually still alive. He's in his 90s. He's still hopping around. If you want to know more about Jimmy Carter, you can ask Miss Holland. She loves the guy. He was a Christian fundamentalist. That means that he thought that the Bible should be interpreted literally. Everything that literally happened in there happened. That's written. He's a peanut farmer from Georgia. And many Americans, especially after the Watergate debacle, they felt that politicians were not good, and they believed that they needed a political outsider. And this political outsider came in the form of a peanut farmer from Georgia. Same problems are going to be happening in the United States when Carter enters the presidency, as they were when Ford left. We still have high inflation, high unemployment, and Carter tries to beat this crisis, this energy crisis, this oil crisis, with, again, asking Americans to cut their consumption of oil and gas. But he goes a little further than Wynne did. He actually placed taxes on gas-guzzling cars. He also removed price controls on oil and gas produced here in the United States so that they would have to compete with OPEC nation gas. He also extended tax credits to people who are going to try to develop alternative energy like solar, wind, and solar and wind and water. Just like Ford, Carter has no answer for the rising inflation. He has no answer for stagflation. He has no answer for the rising unemployment. And eventually, in 1980, he is also going to be voted out of office in favor of switching parties again, see if we can work around this time, and this next one will be Reagan. Even though his domestic policy was not very good, it was not well received, it did not work, his foreign policy was very, very good. He was often celebrated for his policies towards human rights. He is actually credited as one of the people who helped to end apartheid in South Africa. His administration does include more blacks and women than any administration before it. Many draft dodgers had tried to get out of the draft of Vietnam by moving to Canada. And after the war, they wanted to come back, but they couldn't. They dodged the draft. That's actually a crime. But he actually gives amnesty, so he pardons. Amnesty is when you pardon an entire group of people. He pardons the people who fled to Canada and other countries to try to get out of the draft, so that a lot of them were able to come home. During his tenure in office, the Supreme Court actually started to turn against affirmative action. Even though he was committed to it, the Supreme Court said that affirmative action should not be the only tool used in admissions into college. They did say that it could be a tool, but it cannot be the only tool. Again, if you remember, affirmative action is a policy that was created by President Johnson during President Johnson's administration that would give minorities and women kind of a leg up in college admissions in any jobs that got federal money. In the 1970s, this guy from California, he was a white guy, he sued the University of California because he said that affirmative action was wrong and was actually racist pretty much against white males. Kind of won his argument when the Supreme Court said that race could not be the only factor in admissions into their medical school, but it could be a factor. Carter is going, his foreign policy is going to be a totally different than that of Ford and Nixon. He is going to reject realpolitik. He's going to reject détente, and his foreign policy is going to be embracing of foreign human rights. If a country had bad human rights violations against their own citizens, he actually didn't want to have anything to do with that country. He actually cut off aid to some countries that we had been friends with, but he believed those countries were harming their people and rejecting their people's human rights, putting their people down, maybe placing those people in jail because they wouldn't follow what the government thought they should follow. Countries that imprisoned their citizens because their citizens spoke out against their country, or tortured their citizens or their citizens' families because those citizens were speaking out against their countries. Those countries, he actually stopped talking to. He cut off relations with those countries. One of those countries, again, was China. He pulled back some of the relations that we had with China, pulled back some relations with the Soviet Union, and as I said, he will become the first president in the United States to speak out against apartheid. Apartheid is like Jim Crow that was here in the South. It's in South Africa. It was actually a little more stricter than Jim Crow, but it is forced segregation in South Africa. He also was the president who gave Panama back legal rights to the Panama Canal, which the United States had owned since we built it. During Teddy Roosevelt's tenure in office, he gave up all rights to the canal and said that the canal would be given back to the Panamanian people in 2000. Probably his biggest triumph as president was the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords was signed between Israel and Egypt, and the Camp David Accords was the first treaty that was signed between an Arab country and Israel. That these two countries had been fighting for years, pretty much since Israel got its independence in 1948. There had been skirmishes with some Arab country or another, and at Camp David in 1978, these two countries met. Israel and Egypt finally recognized Israel as a nation. Again, this is 1978. Israel got their independence in 1948. In the Camp David Accords, Egypt formally recognized the nation of Israel. It became the first Arab nation to recognize Israel as a nation. In return, Israel agreed to withdraw troops from the Sinai Peninsula and give the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. They actually defeated Egypt in one of the wars. I believe it was the Six-Day War. And they had gained a lot of land, including Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt agreed to recognize them. Israel agreed to get troops out of the Sinai. And to this day, we still give both Egypt and Israel a considerable amount of money for keeping the peace with this Camp David Accords. we just looked at his greatest accomplishment. This probably was his worst, something that one of the